Hey, it's Adriele. Caren and I just wanted to thank everyone who attended our first AMA. If you did not attend the first session, please consider donating if you are watching this recording, and be sure to check out our e-learnings. Thanks so much. I'm Adriele, pronoun she, her. I like to consider myself a DEI thought partner. I got my start in the DEI space well before I even knew that it was DEI or that I could have a career in this space. But when I did enter the sort of professional working space, I started off in recruiting, which led me to diversity recruiting, and then eventually this much broader space of DEI. And I've been doing this work independently for about 2.5, almost 3 years. During my last full-time role, which was about 3 years ago, I met the amazing Caren Young, who is also here, and I'm going to stop talking and let her give her own intro.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Adriele. Hi, everyone. My name is Caren Young. I am the founder and president of The Professional Adult here in lovely Chicago, Illinois. My pronouns are she, her. Like Adriele, I have been on my own since March-ish, February, March-ish of 2020, which is the best time to start a business, really. Prior to that, we did work together for a large software company. However, my background comes from product management. So I am a former manager of product management and a former manager of project management for advertising agencies. So my background comes out of advertising and software development. And I got into DEI because I got really tired of being the only face in space that looked like mine. And I got really, really tired of having to navigate all of the stories around being someone who is in this body in traditionally cis white male dominated industries. So instead of leaving, I dug my heels in, helped to found the very first ERG at Pivotal, which then became VMware, and then moved over to working into DEI full time. And then I met Adriele, and it has been kismet ever since. I am so thankful to have met her and to now know her and to become friends. And so I'm just super excited for today's session.
Awesome. So as we mentioned, there is closed captioning available, so you can enable that. It might, again, automatically pop up, but if you have any issues hearing us, seeing those captions, transcripts, please give us a shout. Don't hesitate. We always think it's really important to start any conversation around DEI with some session norms. And so these are pretty standard and straightforward, but just a few asks is that we're all present, quiet distractions for the next hour, 52 minutes now. Be mindful of what you're sharing. So just being respectful and gracious of each other, which I don't expect there to be any issues there. But again, just making sure we put out these session norms. Be curious with the intent of learning, even if you are not new to the DEI space or strategy. I'm a firm believer that the person next to you is always smarter at something than you are. And so there's always something that you can pick up, no matter how small it is. If you take away at least one new thing, Caren and I have done our job during this session, and that's what we're looking to do, is just impart as much knowledge as we can from our experiences. We prefer that people speak from the I perspective versus collectively saying we or you. It's generally your perspective. And so just be mindful of that. And then, of course, make sure you are just sharing the air time. So just being mindful of how much space you're taking up or even not taking up. We hope that you feel comfortable asking questions. And again, we're such a small group, you can feel free to unmute and just shout something out, but you can also leverage the chat function as well. We, again, treat both equally. And then prioritize self-care. If anything is uncomfortable, you need to step away. Amazon package, dog, please do it. Don't hesitate. We don't mind. And of course, the one-on-one chat is open. So if you have any questions that you prefer to ask anonymously or directly to us, you can message either of us one-on-one, and we're happy to respond to those anonymously. So really for today, this is just designed to be an open AMA Q&A. Anything related to DE&I strategy, Caren and I are both very well experienced in this space. And while we both held full-time roles in DEI, I think that both of us can say that since going into this work independently, we've been able to kind of accelerate through seeing different types of strategies across different industries. We both have a number of clients that we work with both independently and collectively with others. And so we have a lot of insight as to what is happening currently, where things are going, and where things have been in the past. So pretty much anything goes. We're pretty open. Obviously, if there's anything we can't answer or need to think through or whatever else, we'll let you know. We're both pretty transparent. We are recording the session and we'll send out a copy of it after. So feel free to always go back and check that. And yeah, just being mindful of time, depending on what the question is, we may have to table it and follow up with you one-on-one if it requires more time than we have today. Any questions or thoughts? Cool. We'll open it up. Ask us whatever you like about DEI, strategy, anything.
I'll go first. So one thing that I feel like I've been noticing more often through conversations with clients, but also just people posting about is, I think there are a lot of people who want to serve as allies, but feel like they're afraid of what to say because they're probably from certain groups. They haven't historically been marginalized or been disadvantaged in the workplace. And I think while, it's good to encourage maybe like a listening first approach, I don't think a lot of us want to feel like those people shouldn't be able to participate in these conversations. So what's a good way, I think, for people to kind of broach these discussions and be an ally and still kind of share how they're feeling without encroaching on, what other people might be feeling and experiences that they've probably had that others haven't.
I'll let Caren go first. I've been talking enough.
Oh, no problem. I actually like to compare it to learning any other skill. You would not walk into a class or not walk into a job and say, hey, I'm just going to sit here and listen for you to tell me everything about designing a website. You would have done some pre-reading about it. You might have looked at a couple of other websites. And then you can ask questions effectively and you can learn, you can actually listen more effectively that way. And so for those who are striving to be allies and those who are on their ally journey, a listen first approach, I think, is only half correct. I think the other half of it is to be curious and to not necessarily think about it like, okay, well, just download me with all the information. The internet is wide, broad, and vast. Even if your information is not right off the bat, the fact that you are doing some research to start shows that you are truly interested and committed. So what I would recommend for those who want to continue or want to start their ally journey is to start looking around, just see what's there and then have questions and ask those questions and you can move forward from your journey there.
Yep. I would second everything Caren said. I think if we're thinking more sort of strategically about allyship in the context of a workplace, I often see people starting with allyship training or workshops or facilitated discussions, which I don't think is a bad starting point because quite frankly, a lot of people are just not willing to push beyond their comfort zone unless there is a nudge or some sort of formal training offering at work. And when it comes to allyship training, with pretty much anything in the DEI space, I think you have to start with establishing shared language. What does it mean to be an ally? What does it mean to have privilege? What does it mean to have power? And then one thing that I like to really push for people to understand is that allyship is situational. Privilege and power are situational. So for example, if Caren and I join a group of Black women, Black professional women in the DEI space, and there is one trans Black woman in that group, we can be an ally to that one person in that group, right? Just because I'm a Black woman doesn't mean I can't be an ally. So it is very situational. So helping people understand allyship isn't just about race and ethnicity, which is where we tend to gravitate to automatically with just about anything in the DEI space. But just keeping that in mind, getting that shared language together. And then something else that helps a lot is actually presenting people with practical scenarios. If you were to see this thing unfold in front of you at your workplace or even out on the street, how would you react? And giving people the opportunity to think through these scenarios so that when they are presented with an opportunity to be an ally or to speak up or to take action, they're not just like, oh my God, I've never thought about this. I don't know what I would say. I'm afraid I'll mess up. And so the more we can practice and offer that up, I think is helpful and beneficial.
I think, yeah, the only other thing I would add, like that's absolute spot on. I think the only other thing I would add to it is just to ask that as you continue your allyship journey, be willing to be open, and to be open in a way that you may challenge what you already know. For example, when I talk about privilege, I love talking about all the ways that someone who might look not as privileged is very privileged. Like, for example, did you grow up with both of your parents? Then now you have the parental privilege of having stability and not having to worry about the instability of growing up in your life. Did you have the privilege of being of a certain socioeconomic class? Then that again provides you the flexibility and ease to move about life in a certain way. And so thinking about different ways of reframing the conversation and opening up your mind to be able to go, oh, I didn't think about that, or, oh, okay, that makes sense, then helps to open up your mind in other ways, and you can be an ally to other communities.
And I also just added a link in the chat to guidetoallyship.com, which is one of my favorite resources. It was designed by a Black woman, and it is updated quite regularly and frequently. So highly recommend leveraging that and sharing it. All right, what other questions do you all have for us? And please ask follow-up questions as well if you have any.
I have a follow-up question. Hi, Adriele. Hi, Caren.
Hey.
So I've seen a lot in the literature, and something that I am sort of grappling with as well, in that allyship, in the way that it's constructed a lot of the time, inherently has a power dynamic within it, right? If you are an ally, you are sort of, I think it can be sort of sidelined with sort of saviorism a lot of the time, like allies are there to assist and to help. And I've seen, and sort of my preference also is sort of to go towards the idea of coalition building. And I'm wondering if you've seen that as well, and how you've talked about some of those inherent power dynamics as well, because it's kind of given my audience, I will tend to sort of use one or the other depending on sort of how evolved the group is, but I'm curious if you sort of default to one or the other.
I personally don't. So I take the same approach as you, in that I like to really get a feel for who I'm working with and who the group is, and get an understanding of what's going to actually resonate with them versus not. So I find that that is typically the best approach. Caren, do you have a default or generalized approach that you take?
No.
That's the short answer. When you mentioned savior mode, it made me think of, oh my gosh, Dolly Chu. I don't know if you've heard of her, but she wrote this book. I think it's, now I have to Google it, but I think it's called The Person You Mean to Be, How Good People Fight Bias. And she talks about that savior mode and hits some other really important things. She talks about this idea of allyship going after not being a good person, but a good-ish person, right? So it's like this constant journey, and it's not just I'm getting to this final destination of being good and a perfect ally, but good-ish. So this continuous journey. And so I think that to me is more so the piece to drive home, no matter what your approach is again, getting people to realize allyship, power, privilege are situational, and that this is a continuous journey. And again, it may be coming up with coalitions. Sometimes that takes the form of employee resource groups or ERGs, which can, of course, be helpful, but not always feasible depending on who you're working with, especially if it's a smaller organization or an organization that lacks diversity. It's really hard to start employee resource groups when you don't even have the very people that would comprise those groups, right? So I think your approach, as with pretty much anything in the DEI space, almost always has to be tailored to whoever you're working with and the desired outcomes.
Thanks.
Of course. What else?
I do have another question, but I want to be mindful of others who might in the group as well. So yeah. Anybody else? Otherwise I'll go.
Go for it.
So my question is actually pretty related to something you just said, which is guidance you would give to folks starting their DEI strategy from scratch, and how you manage the divide between what people think they need and what they might actually need. So here, and then I'll sort of talk about where this question is coming from. So I come from sort of like a data-driven, pragmatic approach where typically when I'm building strategy, I want to know the historical context. I want to see the data and sort of build from there and build relationships. But a lot of that is less optical. It's less sexy. It's not as flashy. And what companies often want to see is sort of the optical statements and the ERG groups and like the structures that they have been taught to sort of look for when they're looking for a diverse organization. And I have to sort of navigate that conflict a little bit. So I'm just wondering from your perspective, like brand new company starting from ground, like from sort of a baseline, would love your perspective to see if there's like a different way to sort of manage that or balance sort of those two camps.
Oh my God, can I start?
Did you see she's like exploding?
Oh my God. I'm incredibly excited about this because this is how I actually start with company. My background is as a product manager. So I build it always as if I'm building a product. That is exactly how I build it. And so I tell people right off the bat, yes, a qualitative approach of statements and vision boards, that's all wonderful, that's all fine. It doesn't mean a lot.
Yeah.
But a purely quantitative approach with only data and numbers also doesn't mean a lot either because you're dealing with people and not numbers. So I always ask the following few questions when I start. Why are you doing this?
Yeah.
Why are you doing it now? Who are you trying to appease?
Yep.
And by answering those three questions, that gives me a sense of where they actually are in their journey. So that helps to answer, are they truly on a DEI journey? Are they being reactive to an event that has happened? Are they doing this because they actually know it is the right thing to do? Are they doing it because they feel like it is the right thing to do?
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the answer to one of those four questions, I can then start to dig in deeper and say, okay, say this is, you feel like it's the right thing to do because that's what everybody's talking about right now is, oh my God, we're all talking about DEI. It's like, okay, well, if you feel like this is the right thing to do, what happens if you don't do it? What happens to competitors in your marketplace that have done this and what competitors in your marketplace who have done it poorly? What has happened? And I literally take them on that journey. I will write out personas with folks. I will roadmap with folks. I will do an audit. Like I literally treat it as if I am building a product to go into market. Because if you can clearly understand and identify your reasons, your metrics, your pathways, then the external outputs, things like statements and the CEO's AMA or the CEO's glossy video, all of those things are all outputs after explaining who you are, why you're doing this, and what you actually hope to get out of it. So my recommendation is always, and especially since you're a data person, treat it as if you're building a product.
Yeah, thanks, Caren.
I don't really have anything to add to that. Caren and I have very similar approaches, which is why we've built so many different things together, in that we think of it in that way. I'm not a product person, but I've learned from Caren the importance of, balancing out the quantitative and qualitative side of things and making sure that your approach is truly iterative and doesn't feel like there's just like a final destination that you're going after. But yeah, I mean, thinking about the people I've encountered and the organizations I've encountered where there's been pushback or there's this conflict between, well, so our competitor did this, or we saw Google do this, and they have ERGs and they have all this stuff. And I think the questions that Caren mentioned are important and just continuing to dig, but why? Like how, just because you saw this organization do this thing, what do you think it's going to do for you? What is the desired outcome? And what tells you that this is the correct thing or project or path that you should be taking? And the more you have people dig into those questions, the easier it is for you to start to be like, well, here's what I think works. Here's some data and information, both quantitative and qualitative, to back it up, and outlining sort of step by step, and keeping in mind like the sort of layers of accountability that need to be a part of any change management process is really important as well.
Thanks.
Can you tell we get excited about strategy?
Oh, I'm right there with you.
Yes,
I love it.
yes.
I just think that there's there people who are excited about this work, I think, who haven't done the strategy work before tend to have markers in their mind for what success looks like that are actually different from the substantive ones that I think you might set in a strategy. And that's I think the rift often that needs to be bridged. But your perspectives are really valuable. Thanks.
Yeah.
I think that I think actually you brought up a really interesting point, Lena, that I have been kind of toying with some of my newer clients, is the idea that, yeah, a lot of clients want to see some low-hanging fruit, like some sort of proof that we're doing things, because sometimes strategy takes a long time and it's deeply unsexy work and it's kind of behind the scenes. I don't see a problem at all with throwing in carrots as you're building your larger roadmap. So, as you're building, and I think one of the easiest ways of doing that is external check-ins. So as you're building it, you have like a monthly email or a monthly call saying, hey, here's where we are in the process, or here's what we've been working on, just so that it's not a black box and people can still see and mark the behavior. I know with one of my larger clients, we had something called Conversations in the Commons, and we did it every quarter. And it was literally it was kind of like an AMA. We had a defined topic, but it was kind of like an AMA that we invited the entire organization to. And it was just a good way of checking in with folks to talk about what we're doing and what we want to talk about and what might be interesting and what may in its way into the roadmap. So that's a way of giving a tiny little carrot in between all the rest of the road mapping. And so that might be something else you may want to pull in also.
Yeah, I love that. Conversations in the Commons. That's a good one.
I think that's such a good call out. I think I've seen that the lack of transparency and communication pose so many issues for organizations that are embarking on a DEI strategy or journey even early on, because I have one client now that I'm pretty much like, we need to pause and get all of you aligned. Like, we need to reestablish psychological safety and ways of communicating, simply because you have leadership coming in and saying, okay, DEI committee, what are you all doing? None of them were hired to do DEI. They're salespeople, they're engineers, they're people. None of them were hired to do DEI. And yet their leadership team every other week is like, well, you asked for this money, what are you doing? How are we making progress? What's the latest, right? And so figuring out, number one, getting everyone to understand that this is everyone's job and that it has to be led by leaders. Having buy-in from a leader is not enough, meaning someone that's going to just say, yes, go do that and sign a check, not enough. You need your leaders to actually be participating, walking the talk, as we like to say, and actually involved, right, in the work that's being done. And so I think that those open lines of communication, transparency are so critical in actually accomplishing, various parts of your journey. So definitely add an extra check mark by that one, for sure. What other questions or thoughts or comments? Challenges?
One thing kind of connected to my first question I'm always thinking about is how to bring more people into this journey and to gain more buy-in, because I do think there are clearly some people who totally resent these efforts, but I think there are people who can be reached, and maybe the messaging just isn't properly connecting this with them. So, from a strategic standpoint, but more from like an internal messaging perspective, what are some mistakes you see companies making when they're launching DEI efforts, but maybe they're not either like articulating the goals well enough to other people, or it's just not connecting with stakeholders in a proper way, to the sense where you may be kind of having people who aren't as engaged because they don't understand why it's so valuable?
Yeah. I mean, if we're kind of taking a step back, you'll hear most DEI folks say that most people are going to fall into the moral imperative of DEI or the business imperative. Some folks fall in between that, right? We understand that this is the human right, good thing to do, but then also looking at the numbers, I'm like, it doesn't hurt to have a diverse, group of people working here, because we can be more innovative and actually drive revenue, right? And so I think some people make the mistake, especially when DEI is being driven by employees and grassroots efforts, in that they lean too heavily into the emotional piece, getting people to empathize. Why aren't you understanding this? Why don't you hear me? Why don't you see me, right? And that just does not resonate for everyone. And so I think finding a balance of helping people understand how this work directly impacts them is so important, right? And so that's part of like making sure you're tailoring any DEI efforts. If you're doing workshops or, any education, which is usually the most common form of DEI efforts across an organization, making sure that you're not just giving people this sort of out of the box standard, unconscious bias training. It doesn't work, right? And it's not going to resonate with everyone, but actually considering who is the team that I'm working with? What is this group of people? What actually speaks to, if I'm trying to get C-suite executives bought in, board members bought in, actually having conversations with those individuals to see what actually moves them is really important. And so I think the more you can do that, of course it takes work, but the more that you can start to understand what drives people and what's going to motivate them and connect to their everyday work, the more successful your efforts can be. People think, if I am supporting DEI, that means I have to go to every ERG meeting. I have to be present for every, cultural celebration. That's not the case, right? If you are, for example, a manager on a sales team and you're responsible for securing new partnerships, DEI lens, make sure you're not securing the same types of partnerships every day. Go beyond your network, right? So we all have the ability to affect change within our parameters of our day-to-day. So the more we can get people to understand that piece, I think the more successful you'll see your efforts be.
Yeah, Adriele, you're right, especially with the two different camps of like, again, data versus emotion. I used to lean really hard into the data point. I used to lean really hard into it is financially sound for you to have a diverse team and organization. I've actually backed off of that a little bit. And I have pivoted more towards it is organizationally sound. If you are an organization that wants to last, if you are an organization that wants to be on the forefront of creating and shaping the way that business runs, then you have to be creative in how your organization runs. So that just then opens the door into, well, you need a diverse staff of people because you need to get experiences and be able to draw from everybody in your organization. And people have different interests and backgrounds, so you can then use that into the new product of your work. Also, being able to pivot that way means that the cost to market is cheaper because, again, you're having everybody work on stuff. Then people feel more fulfilled because they're actually interested in the work that they do. And if they're interested in the work, they're going to stay. So they're not going to turn over as much. So I've started to kind of blend the two together. And it's been surprisingly effective, where it's not just a focus on the numbers and not just a focus on it is the right moral thing to do, but focusing on, do you want to be an organization of the future or not? And if you do, you have to think about things differently.
It's so interesting that you mentioned just kind of leaning into the data. I find often that people that have done this work, especially a lot in the tech space, tend to lean very heavily on the data, right? Data-driven outcomes, data-driven decisions. And when I started, I was told in order to get approval, to gain buy-in from leaders, I had to have a data-driven strategy and approach. Everything was centered around data. And that was frustrating because sometimes, as Caren mentioned, like the work we're doing is for and by people, right? It's about people. And so you can't always tie a number to, for example, I facilitate focus groups. The qualitative information that's being shared by these focus groups, you can't put a number on that, right? I could surely assign an arbitrary one, but it doesn't really mean anything. And so I think just being mindful that you do actually find that balance and not lean too heavily on the data side is so important. What else?
Are there any, I guess, just to go off that, are there any topics or conversations that you both experience maybe in your trainings that are, I don't want to say the most heavily rejected, but you feel like there's often certain topics you try to bring up where there's the most pushback, and what your strategies are to kind of move forward with those? Like for me, I feel like when I hear people, there are so many people for me who, or what I've noticed, they like reject the term privilege so much because they feel like this is such a direct attack on me and you're blaming me for the world's problems, as opposed to framing it as like, no, this is about us all understanding why our experiences are different. And you may not realize it because you've never looked internally this way. Like, are there any topics like that where you see a lot of pushback, and like, what's your strategy for navigating it?
Yeah. I would say yes, and that is probably one of the most common, is when you bring up power and privilege, people tend to kind of clinch up and they're like, oh my gosh, that's not me, right? And so my approach for that, I think I mentioned earlier, is just kind of getting people to understand that power and privilege are, again, situational. And I often find that people relax when I share an example like the one I shared earlier, where it's like, I, as a Black woman, still have the power and privilege in certain situations, right? As a college educated Black woman, I still have a level of power and privilege over a Black woman that may not have had the opportunity to go to college, if I'm presented with an opportunity that requires a degree, right? That's an immediate. And so just getting people to understand it's situational. It is not just, when we're talking about diversity, there's so many dimensions beyond gender, race, and sexual orientation, right? All of those things, like Caren mentioned, socioeconomic status, where you're from, your religious beliefs, your political beliefs, all these layers. And so I think getting people to really understand that is important. The other topic I often get pushback on is in the realm of bias, and people often want to say, oh, well, I don't see color. I mean, yes, in whatever utopia we all want to live in, that would be wonderful. But our society as a whole sees color, right? And color is attached to power and privilege. Color, race, ethnicity are associated with oppression. And even if I, as an individual, don't want to quote unquote see color, that is pretty much just saying that I'm okay with erasing or pretending like inequities don't exist for specific groups. And so helping people to understand that concept, I find is helpful for sort of shifting their perspective a little bit. But I would say those are the two that I get the most pushback on. Caren, what about you?
Pretty similar. I almost always get the privilege conversation, almost always. And so I define privilege as ease of movement in our society. If you have more privilege, it is easier for you to move around in this society. I then talk about the fact that, again, like Adriele mentioned, and I love the way that she frames that. I might actually steal that, by the way, that it is situational. I love that. I use a video game example. This is probably also going to date just how old I actually am. That back in the day, we used to buy the video game manuals of like how to actually learn how to play the video game. And for me, privilege is, well, we all have access and the ability to buy the manual, but some of us only have the front cover. Some of us have all 5 chapters. Some of us only have chapters 1 and 4. Now, that doesn't mean we can't play and win the game. Just for some of us, it's harder because we have to figure out stuff that we don't actually have. That's privilege. And so how do you exercise your privilege for good? If you have all 5 chapters and you know your friend only has the front cover, share your book. That's you being an ally. That's you exercising your privilege. Share your book. And so that's kind of how, again, taking it out of that frame, and I work with a lot of tech companies, so it goes over like gangbusters. It works out nicely. And then also I get a lot of, and this has been fairly recently, why are we not talking about cis white men? We're talking all the time about all these other groups. Why are we not talking about the struggles that we endure also? And I say that with the big dripping sarcasm that it comes with. And so my answer to that is, sure, let's talk about it. There are absolutely ways that you are underprivileged. Absolutely. There are spaces that I can be in as a Black woman that you absolutely can't. I come from a different socioeconomic class than a lot of folks. That means that I have a different ease of use in society. It still is privilege. So sure, you want to talk about it? Let's talk about it. How are we allies to you? And that completely deflates their bubble because, yeah, I'm admitting, yeah, it absolutely is situational. So now that you understand how you feel about that, you can take those feelings you have and now apply them to someone else. Here's where we can now have a lesson in compassion and empathy. Take that. So yeah, so those are the 2 big things that I have that come up pretty often.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Other questions, thoughts?
Hi, my name's Natalie, and I guess my question is more or less like, as I'm starting and, within my own company to develop strategy and programming, I find myself like, I've done the trainings, I've done the coursework, and all of that. But when I have specific questions, like, who do you guys go to? Like, because obviously I'm sure that, as society evolves and changes and new things come up, there are times when you don't always have the answer. So who do you go to in those moments?
Yeah. For me, it's my network. So you'll even, if we're connected on LinkedIn, you'll see me pose questions to people. I, of course, have a couple of mentors in this space. I, of course, have partners like Caren that I work with frequently. But one thing you'll notice, and I think we've kind of highlighted this, is that there's never a one size fits all approach to anything you're doing in DEI. So even if I have a question, for me, I prefer to ask several people about their approach or what they've seen, because it's going to vary based on the organization, the size of the organization, how the people actually move or treat DEI. And so I always say, and outside of DEI, I also do career coaching, and I always say your network is your net worth. I firmly believe that. It is so valuable to have other people in this space. And I like to personally build really close relationships with people that sort of move in the same way that I do, right? Or that think in the same way that I do, but also looking for DEI practitioners that have different approaches. A couple of weeks ago, someone randomly reached out to me on LinkedIn, and he's been working in the DEI space for over 25, 30 years. Living in, I think he's in the DMV area, completely different ballgame from what I see here in New York or what I see in the Bay Area, or even, with my clients that are in the UK. Like, it is a very different type of approach to DEI in the DMV area, where people are still working in office. But we were able to have this amazing conversation. I learned things from him, he learned things from me. And so just don't discount the ability and the support that you can get from your network and what you can learn from it. Because there's truly only so much that, coursework and certifications can teach you. I think there's certainly some value there, but the connections to other people in this space are invaluable.
Yeah, I'll definitely say Adriele is much better at networking than I am. She's so much better at it than I am.
I love it.
I'm a lurker. So, I have notifications from when Adriele posts, so then I will then go in and start reading through everyone's comments. And then like she does, I will still put together, what is the general consensus? What is the trend? How does this trend differentiate than what we saw a year ago? I can literally never get a product person out of my head as much as I really desperately want to. I can't. So I'm looking at trends over time. What were we talking about a year ago that we're now talking about? Okay, is this something that I need to start thinking about? Do I need to start reading more about this? What are people starting to say? If I do start reaching out to folks, I do have a couple of mentors, like, how do you start to put those together? So again, the concept is the same. The application might be slightly different. Adriele is much more active in how she does it. I am much more passive in how I do it. But I think the concept is still the same, of just get consensus and constantly connect with the larger community.
Absolutely. Yep. And there are also a number of DEI professionals, practitioners, advocates that have groups as well. I see them often on LinkedIn. And so tapping into those groups can be helpful as well. There's one in particular I often recommend. I'll grab it. But the person's name is Raven Solomon, and she does them every Friday, I want to say at 11 a.m. Eastern, but I will grab the link for you. Thanks, Carrie. All right. Any other questions or thoughts, challenges that you face, things you've seen and didn't have answers to?
I have another question, and this one is a trend I'm seeing recently. So, there were all of those companies that sort of were starting in DEI, slower to come along, made their initial statements. I think we're pretty familiar with that flavor. But there's also this other host, I would say they're sort of newer. They tend to be tech companies that have like really embraced the, diving into DEI. And I want to say like they, sort of have this like woke label. And one of the things that I want your perspective on is how would you guide companies that are on that side of the spectrum around their comm strategy? And specifically what I'm talking about is there's a particular company I have in mind who anytime there is sort of like any thing that happens in the world that affects people, and a lot of these are like really sort of like gutting tragedies, the employees want this company to make a statement on behalf of the thing that happened. Makes total sense. I can completely see a world where that is the case. But their head of DEI shared with me, like, at what point does what we're saying no longer matter because we're making a statement about everything that happens in the world? So I don't have an answer to this. I think that what they tried to do is sort of align, they're having some difficulty dealing with that, but I'm just wondering what your perspective is generally on like a DEI comm strategy and a company using their voice and their platform to really support their employees, but to do it in a way that is sort of connected and intentional and makes sense and is sustainable. So that's something that's been like juggling around in there, and I would love to hear your perspectives.
Want to go first, Caren, or you want me to?
Yeah, I'll take it. Yeah, I actually had a client. Well, I have a client who is going through that right now, where there were a couple of large events that they absolutely needed to respond to. And then it got to a point where anytime anything happened in our world, which seems like it's falling apart, there was a certain group of folks who would look to them and be like, well,
yeah.
What are you going to say about this? And it got to the point that we had to have a conversation of, if you are always talking, people will stop listening.
Yeah.
And so instead of talking, what are you going to do about it? So if we have, like, for example, in Chicago, we had the Highland Park shooting, which happened a few weeks ago. Holy cow, only a few weeks ago. And so instead of putting out a statement, the organization was like, okay, so what are we going to do to actually support our team members? Are we going to give them time off? Are we going to make sure that, hey, do we now start looking at helping with transit costs? Like, what does that look like to actually support, so that we're not just talking, we're actually doing? The fact that inflation has been wild, but the organization, like another organization, has done like really well. So how do you then start distributing some of that money back to the employees? And you don't put restrictions on it, because you know what? People need money for different things. So how do you do that? So I would say, instead of putting out a statement for everything, you can say, hey, so here's what we're doing.
Yep. I've seen and had to help organizations navigate this several times, more than I care to actually have been a part of. But I think it kind of boils down to having to define the company culture. What is our stance on life events, and how frequently are we going to address them? At this point with social media, it's not like before, where occasionally something happens and people get word of it and a company releases a statement because it's huge tragedy. Things are happening all day, every day, and it's just near impossible to keep up with that, especially as a DEI person. If this is your profession, keep up with that, manage a strategy, project manage change management, support HR and their initiatives and efforts. Like, there are so many layers. And so I think it's really important to be mindful of that. I think, to Caren's point, at some point, it's like, it's kind of performative. It's like we're putting out these statements and then what, right? Versus, can we, redirect our funds and leave it up to employees to choose? I've seen more organizations doing like employee-led giving, which I think is a great approach. But I think there's only so much that organizations can do in terms of putting out statements. And I don't think it helps. I think what helps is, actually putting your money where your mouth is, or actually taking the steps to create a truly more, diverse, equitable, and inclusive working environment. It could be, I've seen, some organizations work very closely with their ERG groups, where they said, oh, this thing has happened. We recognize it. Does your group want to put something out or put a statement out, and leave it up to that group that identifies to actually share that information? So there are a number of approaches, but I think it really boils down to the company's culture and how the organization as a whole is deciding to move with when it comes to addressing or not addressing current events. There's no right or wrong answer, really, unfortunately.
And have you seen companies that have done that well, like really sort of been very concrete about sort of when they respond and how they respond versus when they don't choose to say things? Because I feel like I've heard a lot of that in the abstract, but I personally have never actually seen a company that has sort of like codified that. And I don't know if it's like, I don't know sort of why, but people like, I guess I've never seen an example of that. And I wonder if you have.
Yeah. No, not really. I mean, I think I had one client a few months back, and their sort of stance, their leadership stance was, if someone from an ERG reaches out to leadership and wants us to put out a statement, we will send it on behalf of them as like a company-wide, note, or we'll address it during our stand-ups. On the other end of the spectrum, what I've seen more and more organizations do is say, we're not saying anything about current events or politics or events. And if you, within your ERGs or grassroots groups or Slack channel communities, decide to talk about this, that's on you, but we are not saying anything about anything. In some instances, I think that might be a better approach for a lot of organizations. If we're thinking again about the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, a lot of times people will put out these statements. What I've noticed is a lot of times companies will put out these statements that lean pretty liberally. And then you've got folks working in your organization that aren't liberal. They may be moderate, they may be conservative, they may be whatever else. And that makes them feel as if they don't belong. I had a client more specifically that was dealing with this very issue during the announcement, that sort of first wave of announcements with Roe v. Wade, being pretty much nixed. And they put out a statement and it backfired. And it was actually their DEI committee that put out the statement. It was like in the company-wide Slack channel, and they got pushback. People reaching out to HR saying, I don't agree with this. I, actually want to see Roe v. Wade be abolished or be dismantled. And so that caused some friction within the organization. And now they're at a place where they're like, we don't even want to put out any statements about anything because we don't want to ruffle any feathers. And so they went on to create Slack communities for these different issues and topics, women's issues, parental issues, Black and brown folks issues, all these things. And they're like, okay, if you want to discuss something or share an article, join that specific group. If you don't like it, if you're not interested, no need to be a part of it. So, yeah, and so far it's worked well.
Yeah, I actually think that is a better solution, is to kind of let it be more targeted. I also think, again, going back into being about it instead of talking about it is a better solution. Like, for example, because of the Dobbs decision, overturning Roe versus Wade, look into what does your health policy actually say? What does your insurance policy actually say? And then make sure that it is supportive. And so that way, those who want to participate and partake can, and those who don't also can. So it's there. It is available if you want to take part of it. So you're voting with your dollars instead of your words.
It's a great point. So really thinking about sort of the current issues as they pertain to your organization, and if they do in fact impact the very people that are working there. Anything else? I know we're coming up on time here. We've got about 6 minutes left.
What are you both optimistic about right now in terms of the DEI space?
I'll let you go first, Caren.
This is a good question.
It is.
Because my answer most of the time is I'm not. that's most of the time, it's like I'm not optimistic. But what I can say that I am optimistic about is that the DEI space is growing up. The space is growing up. And so I don't think that there are as many firebrands. I don't think that there's as many people who are like, I think what we're starting to see now is, okay, if we really want change to happen, how do we do it inside and outside of organizations? How do we start to work together? How do we truly start to dismantle systems of oppression? And that's what I'm starting to see. And I hope that that continues. And I also hope that the trend of respecting and honoring people who are doing DEI work from inside of organizations also continues. So that's what I say I'm optimistic about, is that it feels like DEI is starting to grow up a little bit.
I would second that. I think, having worked in the space for several years, we've seen it transform rather quickly, especially when it came to the pandemic and people, I think, were forced to be at home and constantly faced and presented with a lot of the inequity and oppression that exists in our world that they perhaps didn't really have to look at before. I think that also this sort of hybrid working environment that we have now has shifted many folks' perspectives. And so, yeah, I'm pretty optimistic in terms of, as Caren said, just the maturity that is occurring in the DEI space. I'm seeing fewer and fewer people just reach out to be like, hey, we need training. I think more and more people have reached out to me, at least, prospective clients, to say, hey, we're looking to actually build out our strategy. We're looking at how can we better equip our leaders to navigate this diverse space or these diverse set of employees that we've now hired, or how do they actually communicate better in these hybrid situations where we've got some people that are 100% remote, some that are 50% remote, some folks that just want to be in the office all the time, right? And so I think DEI is certainly shifting from just a check the box, hey, here's another unconscious bias training or how to be anti-racist, to more, here's how we actually build an equitable and inclusive workplace. Here are the steps that we're going to take. Here's how we get our leaders involved. Here is an actual budget for this work, right? Because we're going to take it seriously and not just put it on to the people that have historically been marginalized and weren't even hired to do DEI, but we're going to actually hire some folks that have expertise in this realm. So I'm hopeful about that piece. I think the economy is in a very odd place right now, as many of us know, but I also see that businesses are recognizing that they do need support when it comes to DEI, because otherwise you're left with people that, especially I've noticed with the younger Generation Z, I commend them because they're not coming in quiet to these inequities or inequitable workplaces. They're coming in, they're like, here are my boundaries. This is what I will do. This is what I won't do. This is what I expect from this organization. And as a millennial myself, I'm like, whoa, like, this is incredible. But I think it's forcing organizations to invest more time and energy and money into DEI, because they recognize that future generations are not going to just come in and say, okay, we'll tolerate this, but instead they are ready to shake up these inequitable spaces and actually force change to happen.
Yeah, I absolutely second that. Yeah, it's exciting. It's exciting to see. It's exciting to see. And so, yeah, my hope is that it grows up.
For sure. Any final questions or thoughts for us before we wrap up? This was our first collective AMA, so we appreciate you all joining us. Caren and I think it was about a year and a half ago, or maybe even 2 years at this point, we started, as we were rolling out our businesses independently, we realized that clients were coming to us and sort of asking us the same things over and over. And so we started writing what we thought would be a book, and we called it DEI in a Box. And it quickly evolved into a self-guided e-learning course, which was kind of open for the masses. But then we realized it would be more impactful to do sort of a train the trainer for existing and aspiring DEI practitioners. So that is something we just wanted to share with you all. It might be of interest. Obviously, there's no pressure to look at it or whatever else, but we even appreciate feedback on it. But again, it's called DEI in a Box if you want to check it out. If you're interested in working with us, or if you know people that could benefit from working with us, please drop us a line. And we also have some other DEI courses available as well, which we'll share out via email along with the recording of today's session. But thank you all again for joining us. And as always, don't hesitate to reach out if we can help with anything else. And As Caren mentioned, I love networking. So I'm pretty sure I'm connected with all three of you on LinkedIn, but if I can connect you with anyone in my network, I'm always happy to do that as well. Any final things, Caren?
I'm trying to get better at it. So please feel free, connect. Again, I'm much quieter than Adriele when it comes to this kind of thing. I am learning from her on how to be better about networking. So yeah, please do. I absolutely love this work. I love doing this work. I love chatting about this with folks and hopefully building the next wave and the next level of what DEI can look like. So
awesome. Thank you all again.
Thank you so much.
All right. Hope to see you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
bye-bye.